They say the sea keeps secrets, but tonight, as the storm claws at the ancient stones of Mont Saint-Michel, one of its darkest truths is about to surface. A body long buried, a betrayal centuries in the making, and a manuscript inked in vengeance. Justice is coming, not with the scales but with the wings of a raven. Listen closely, because what you're about to hear isn't just a murder mystery. It's a confession written by time itself. The narrow causeway unfurled ahead of us like an ancient scar carved across the sea, its stone spine glistening with retreating tidewater that shimmered like cold mercury beneath the brooding twilight. Each turn of the wheels echoed faintly against the vast emptiness around us, as if the very sea were holding its breath while we approached the fabled Isle of Valemont, an immense time-worn fortress that rose from the tidal flats like something summoned, not built. Its towering silhouette, framed by the bruised and cloud-heavy October sky, bore the grotesque elegance of a long-forgotten cathedral, spires crooked and clawing upward like fingers trying to scratch their way free from the earth. Inspector Lucien Véron, seated beside me with his overcoat buttoned high, exhaled slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the skyline with something between awe and unease. "Striking, isn't it?" he murmured, his voice barely louder than the wind that carried the scent of salt and ancient decay. "Yet there's something here that does not wish to be seen." As if in answer, a murder of ravens erupted from the ramparts ahead, their jagged cries tearing across the air in discordant shrieks, wheeling in tight, chaotic spirals above the crumbling towers. Our driver, a gaunt man with sea-scoured skin and eyes sunken deep into shadowed hollows, tightened his grip on the steering wheel and muttered something under his breath in Breton, a language that seemed more curse than dialect. When prompted, he finally spoke, his English broken and low. "The island, she is old, older than the abbey, older than the books, and she remembers." I exchanged a glance with Verne, who leaned slightly forward. "Remembers what?" A pause, and then the driver replied, "The Grimoire Nocturne, the Book of Midnight, kept hidden in the monastery's undercroft. It is said to contain not scripture but secrets, confessions, obsessions, rituals inked in madness by a monk who claimed to hear voices from beneath the stone. Those who read it, they are never quite the same. Some disappear, others go blind, and a few—" His voice trailed into silence as the great walls of Valemont's Abbey loomed into view, their sheer height blotting out the last weak rays of sunlight like a curtain falling between worlds. Just beyond the gates, shrouded in drifting fog, stood a lone figure, tall and slender, with hair the color of frost and a stare that cut through the distance. He approached our vehicle with the composed gravity of a man long used to commanding attention. "Inspector Véron," he greeted, his tone refined and dispassionate. "Welcome to Valemont. I am Professor Aldrich Hale." His handshake was cold, firm, and carried with it an unspoken warning. "We've been expecting you. The gathering has already begun." With that, he turned and led us through the iron gate, into the heart of the abbey. The stone courtyard beyond was steeped in silence, its statues half consumed by ivy and time, their eyes hollow, their hands outstretched toward nothing. Shadows bled from every corner, and the air inside the ancient walls had the weight and stillness of a tomb. Voices murmured through the cloisters, low and reverent, as though the scholars assembled here feared waking something slumbering in the stone. Among them was a woman, tall, poised, with raven-dark hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Dr. Celine Marrow," Hale said, motioning toward her, "our expert in ancient texts, particularly those deemed dangerous." Her gaze locked onto mine, not with welcome, but with silent appraisal, as though measuring whether I belonged or was already too late. As we stepped deeper into the heart of Valemont, past archways etched with indecipherable runes and stairwells that spiraled down into unlit hollows, the silence grew thicker, almost sentient. Somewhere beneath us, hidden in the bones of this island, a manuscript waited, and with every step we took, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't descending into a place of knowledge, but walking straight into a trap set by the past. The doors of the scriptorium groaned open on rusted iron hinges, releasing a slow, mournful echo that coiled through the vaulted stone corridors like a warning. Inside, the air was thick, stagnant with centuries of candle smoke, decayed parchment, and something deeper, older, like the breath of the abbey itself held in suspense. High-arched windows, coated with a film of dust and age, allowed only narrow shafts of light to pierce the gloom, illuminating swirls of dust and casting uneasy shadows across the uneven stone floor. Along the walls stood ancient bookcases, crammed with leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked, many bearing the marks of water damage, scorch marks or strange sigils no modern scholar could easily identify. At the heart of this sanctum stood a raised lectern of blackened oak, carved with motifs of ravens, weeping saints, and circular runes that seemed to shift if stared at too long. Upon it rested the Codex Umbra, a manuscript so seldom referenced even among elite circles that some dismissed its existence as myth. Bound in what appeared to be dark, mottled leather and fastened with tarnished silver clasps etched with lunar symbols, it seemed to breathe in the dim light, its pages fluttering without wind. Dr. Ilara Venn stood motionless beside it, cloaked in the somber grey of academic neutrality, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed the storm within. Her reputation in medieval paleography was unmatched, known not only for her deciphering of obscure monastic texts, but for her controversial belief that certain manuscripts were responsive to human perception. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady, tinged with restrained emotion. "The Codex is not merely a document," she said. "It's a vessel, possibly a record of the Black Quill Circle's final rituals before their execution. And it may contain embedded references to individuals from my father's generation. He was tracing this before he disappeared under circumstances no one dared to explain." The mention of her father, a respected scholar himself, sent a ripple of unease through our small gathering. Captain Hargreaves, military mind turned government observer, exchanged a glance with me. "You believe this book was connected to his fate?" he asked. Dr. Venn's eyes didn't waver. "I don't believe. I know." The tension broke as a young man stepped forward from the shadows, a gaunt figure in threadbare academic garb, his boots cracked and jacket stained with ink and what looked like ash. Ashen Moreau. His name had once been spoken with reverence in academic halls across Paris and Oxford, before he fell from grace. His expression was tight, as if every word cost him something. "Dr. Venn believes because she wants to believe," he said bitterly, the venom in his voice unmistakable. "But that book doesn't care about belief. It remembers. It chooses." Dr. Venn flinched ever so slightly, but said nothing. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken history, shared wounds that still festered beneath the surface. Professor Callum Virel soon entered, a tall, almost spectral presence in layered ecclesiastical robes, flanked by Brother Eliad, the elderly monk charged with guarding the abbey's more sensitive texts. Virel, voice rich and deliberate, surveyed the room before speaking. "The Codex Umbra is not dangerous merely for what it says, but for what it awakens. You must all understand that this is not simply ink on vellum. It is impressionable. It reflects. It consumes." Brother Eliad, pale-eyed and tremulous, added, "The Codex has not been opened in decades. It is said to react differently to each reader. Some see maps, others see names. One novice saw only fire before he lost his voice forever." Before we could process this, another presence entered, calmer, more grounded. A man in his 50s, wiry and tall, with sandy hair flecked in grey and eyes sharp as shattered glass. "Name's Whitlock," he said, his American accent slicing through the gloom like a blade. "I've followed rumors of this codex from forgotten Vatican vaults to suppressed archives in Prague. Lost 2 colleagues in the process. One vanished without a trace in Tallinn. The other woke up one day unable to speak anything but Latin, dead languages, muttered like prayers." Venn narrowed her eyes. "And yet you came." Whitlock offered a crooked smile. "Some truths cost, but silence costs more." Virel gestured solemnly toward the lectern. "Approach if you must, but know that once you see you cannot unsee. The Codex has a way of anchoring itself to you." We gathered in a tight circle as the final candles were lit, their flames flickering violently as though stirred by invisible breath. The room grew colder. The manuscript's cover creaked open slowly under Venn's hands, and immediately the air changed. The illuminated margins, rendered in aged gold, iron oxide red and bruised blue, came alive with uncanny clarity. Winged ravens bled ink from their feathers, monks with hollow eyes wept over blackened scrolls, and a single figure, a hooded man with a raven's shadow, appeared on multiple pages, always at the edge of the scene, watching. "These illustrations, they're more than decorative," Venn whispered, tracing a finger above the parchment. "They move, they respond." Ashen Moreau's voice was dry and cracked. "They're warnings, scenes of betrayal, ritual, recompense. The book doesn't just tell a story, it predicts one." A sudden knock, 1, 2, 3, sounded from the locked chamber door behind us, though no footsteps had been heard. We froze, the room dimmed and every page of the manuscript flipped wildly, as if caught in a silent storm, and then it stopped, open on a page depicting 5 figures gathered around a book, their faces blurred but strangely familiar. Outside, the cries of ravens pierced the thickening dusk, shrill and relentless, as if something ancient had just stirred beneath the abbey stones and remembered our names. I was torn from an uneasy slumber not by the comforting toll of the abbey's bells, whose solemn rhythm had lulled me into a deceptively peaceful sleep, but by a sound that clawed its way into my soul, a shrill, discordant uproar that shattered the fragile quiet of dawn. It wasn't mere birdsong but a cacophony, a frenzy of ravens screaming with a hysteria that felt almost human, as if mourning something dreadful or protesting something unholy. The sound penetrated the ancient stone walls of the guest chambers like knives, echoing down long-forgotten halls and rattling the very air, waking me with a jolt that left my heart pounding. For a moment I thought it a nightmare. But no, this was real. The sky itself was weeping through the throats of 1,000 black-winged sentinels. I reached for my pocket watch with trembling fingers. 5 o'clock, just past dawn. That strange liminal hour when the world seems suspended between dream and waking. Cold grey light seeped through the narrow window, painting my chamber in ghostly hues. The sea mist outside had not yet lifted, cloaking everything in a shroud of otherworldly stillness. Pulling on my coat with unsteady hands, I rushed to find Whitlock. He stood at his window already dressed, unmoving, as though turned to stone by what he saw. "Listen," he said without turning, voice low and tight with restrained alarm. "Do you hear it? That isn't nature." I joined him, and the sight that greeted me stole the breath from my lungs. The sky above the abbey's highest spire churned with hundreds, no, thousands of ravens, their wings slicing the air in agitated spirals, their cries rising to a volume so intense it hurt to hear. They did not move like ordinary birds. They moved like a storm, a living maelstrom circling something sacred or desecrated. "It's not the weather," I whispered, though I had not yet spoken aloud. The ravens' cries were not confused but furious, desperate. They weren't disturbed by nature, they were nature disturbed. It was a sound older than language, deeper than logic, a reckoning. Whitlock stepped back from the window, face pale. "We need to see for ourselves." We hurried through the abbey's darkened corridors, the cold flagstones beneath our feet groaning with every step as if they too were reluctant to carry us toward whatever horror awaited. The walls seemed to listen. Shadows clung stubbornly to corners, and the lanterns on the walls flickered, casting long, quivering silhouettes. The birds' cries grew louder, a rising tide of sound that pressed down on us like a weight. When we reached the main courtyard and stepped into the open, the full scale of the nightmare unfurled before us, and it was magnificent in its terror. The ravens darkened the sky, diving and shrieking, wings slashing the mist. They circled a single point, the iron cross at the summit of the abbey's tallest tower, and there, silhouetted against the bleak morning sky, was the body, a human figure crucified against the heavens, limbs splayed grotesquely, nailed to the iron like a heretical martyr, the head drooped forward in eternal surrender. Even from the ground, the lifelessness was unmistakable. The twisted position of the limbs, the slackness of the body, the haunting stillness in contrast to the frenzy around it. Death had claimed this soul, and made a spectacle of it. Whitlock's breath caught. "My God," he murmured. "Who would do such a thing? How would they do it?" A chill went through me as I stared upward, the image seared into my memory like a brand. This was no mere murder. This was a message, one written in flesh and elevated for all to see. Others began to arrive, roused by the unnatural uproar. Dr. Alara Venn stumbled into the courtyard, hair half loose and face drained of color. Her gaze followed ours skyward, and then she gasped, a trembling hand rising to her throat. No, that can't be. That's Professor Blackwood." A gasp rippled through the gathering group as Henri Dubois arrived, his usual cold detachment shattered by genuine horror. "Impossible," he said hoarsely. "There's no way up that tower. It's sealed. Unreachable." Then came James Crawford, the pragmatic American scholar, his eyes hard with resolve even as they reflected fear. "We need the authorities, and a doctor, though I doubt even God could help now." Finally, from the direction of the chapel, came Brother Augustin. The old monk walked like a man burdened with knowledge he wished he could forget. His face was pale, his voice barely a whisper. "They've returned," he muttered. "The morning of wings. The ravens. They always know. When death arrives to Mont St. Corbin, they are its heralds, its judges, its mourners." "A murder of crows," I murmured. "No," he corrected softly, eyes fixed on the sky. "Ravens. The old texts speak of it. The morning of wings, when the dead do not rest, and the earth cries out. They circle the soul that has awakened something forbidden." I stared once more at the broken figure above, now haloed in black feathers and blood-red morning light. And in that moment I understood. This wasn't the beginning of an investigation. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Something had been disturbed within these ancient stones, something buried beneath centuries of silence, and the ravens had come not to witness, but to warn. The early morning fog clung to the stones of Mont St. Corbin like an ancient shroud, thick with the scent of moss and history, as the first slivers of daylight cut across the abbey's silhouette, revealing what should not have been there. High atop the central spire, grotesquely impaled upon the very tip, hung the lifeless body of Professor Blackwood, arms outstretched as if in surrender or judgment. A silent procession of black-winged ravens circled above, their cries tearing through the quiet like warnings from another age. The scene seemed less like a murder and more like a ritual, an omen whispered through generations. "It's just superstition," Crawford muttered, though his voice faltered as if even he didn't fully believe his own dismissal. Brother Augustine didn't blink. His eyes, deep and unwavering, were fixed on the tower. "Perhaps, Mr. Crawford, but the Codex Corvus speaks of such signs, of retribution cloaked in feathers and vengeance delivered from the heavens." He motioned toward the grotesque tableau above them, where the birds spiraled in tight, fevered arcs. Dr. Wynne's face had drained of color. Her voice, usually precise and academic, came out quiet but firm. "The positioning, it matches the illumination from page 47, the scholar pierced by the spear of justice, surrounded by the ravens of retribution." Poirot's head turned sharply toward her, interest flickering in his sharp eyes. "You recall this illustration exactly, madame?" he asked. "Yes," she said, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. "I studied it closely last night. The imagery, it stayed with me." Henri Dubois, who had earlier been visibly shaken, now leaned in, a spark of curiosity overtaking his initial horror. "She's right, Monsieur Poirot. The manuscript shows a scholar punished for plagiarism, impaled high, exposed for all to see. A warning, not just a punishment." Poirot's expression darkened, his mind clearly turning over every implication. "And was Professor Blackwood aware of this particular page?" Crawford nodded, more somber now. "We all read it together yesterday. Blackwood was fascinated, said it might be key to decoding the entire manuscript." Before more could be said, the arrival of Inspector Beaumont of the local constabulary broke the spell. A thick-set man with a moustache peppered with grey, and the weary eyes of someone used to simpler crimes, smuggling, drunken brawls, perhaps the occasional livestock dispute. Beaumont took one look at the impaled corpse and paled. "But how is this even done?" he stammered, his Norman accent weighing heavily on each word. "That tower, it is over 50 meters high. No ladders, no scaffolding, no sign of rope. How could anyone—" He trailed off, looking up as though he expected the answer to descend from the clouds. "Unless," Brother Augustin said softly, "the body was placed there by something not of this world." "We will have no such talk," Beaumont snapped, though his eyes lingered on the corpse a moment too long. "This is a police matter. There is an explanation. There must be." Poirot stepped forward, offering his familiar slight bow. "Inspector, permit me to introduce myself. I am Hercule Poirot, and I would consider it an honor to assist in this most unusual case." Recognition flared in Beaumont's eyes. "Poirot, the Poirot. Then yes, please. This is not something we are prepared for." Poirot nodded once. "Indeed. But the question we must answer first is not how this crime was committed, but why it was staged so theatrically. The body, the timing, the ravens, these are not coincidences. This was not merely murder, it was spectacle, and spectacle is always meant for an audience." Dr. Wynne swallowed, her breath visible in the cold morning air. "You think someone intended for him to be found this way? That it was all planned?" Poirot looked up toward the spire, his eyes unreadable. "I think, madame, that this crime is not what it appears to be. The killer did not simply want to end a life. He wanted to send a message, and messages are meant to be understood." Beaumont scribbled hastily in his notebook, but frustration tugged at his brow. "Even so, Monsieur Poirot, the logistics remain impossible. 50 meters, even with planning, how could they do it?" Poirot's eyes twinkled, the faintest glimmer of challenge appearing in his expression. "Ah, but that, my dear inspector, is the heart of our puzzle. How was the impossible? But first, let us examine the scriptorium and the manuscript itself. I have a strong suspicion that the Codex Corvus holds more than history within its pages. It holds motive, and perhaps the name of our killer." As we turned to leave the courtyard and re-enter the time-worn halls of the abbey, something at the base of the great central tower caught my attention and made me halt mid-step. A cluster of black feathers scattered in a pattern too precise to be random, lying like quiet sentinels across the moss-slicked stones. These were not the wind-blown remnants of the circling ravens above, whose silhouettes spiraled restlessly against the pewter sky. These feathers bore an eerie deliberateness, as if placed by unseen hands, part warning, part ritual, part cipher. The ravens screeched overhead in frantic loops, their jagged cries slicing through the misty morning like the wails of grieving spirits, echoing between the towering Norman walls like a dirge for the dead. And there, barely visible through the fogged light, still hung the lifeless silhouette of Professor Blackwood, his body swaying slightly from the high spire, a grotesque marionette outlined in tragic silence, his limbs caught between heaven and stone. It felt less like a death than a message, carved not in words but in horror. As we moved into the abbey's scriptorium, what had once felt like a sanctuary of learning now carried the scent of secrets. The tall Gothic windows funneled cold daylight into sharp beams, casting shadows like jagged wounds across the ancient floor. Every surface seemed to hum with tension, even the air felt brittle, like it might shatter if one breathed too loud. At the room's center stood the Codex Corvus, opened ominously as though mid-sentence, its yellowed parchment whispering secrets through ink-stained symbols that coiled and danced if stared at too long. Poirot moved slowly, eyes sharp behind his calm expression, taking in every fracture of detail, every nuance of atmosphere, as if listening to the very walls for confessions. Behind him, Inspector Beaumont stumbled to keep pace, his heavy boots thudding like clumsy drums against the silent stones, entirely mismatched to the hush that now hung over the place like a funeral shroud. Poirot turned and addressed the group, his voice quiet, but slicing cleanly through the thick quiet. "Let us begin with order, with clarity," he said, folding his hands behind his back. "Each of you must recount what you saw, what you felt, and most of all what you perceived in the professor's final demeanor." Dr. Margaret Wine stepped forward, her usual cool exterior visibly cracked, her lips pressed tight, and her fingers locked together so tightly they shook. "He was energized," she said, her voice brittle, excited beyond reason. He'd found a passage in the manuscript. He believed it would force a re-evaluation of everything we assumed about medieval scholastic traditions. He said it wasn't just a find, it was a revelation. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And the nature of this passage?" he prompted gently. She hesitated. It described a scholar, 13th century, accused of stealing intellectual work, of passing it as his own. The manuscript details his punishment, public, gruesome, final. It mirrors what we saw this morning. A hush followed, broken only by the muffled rustle of robes or the shifting of weight on cold stone. Then Henri Dubois spoke from near the shadowed windows, voice low, bitter. "Blackwood had many such obsessions," he said, "many theories. Not all were his." Poirot's gaze locked on him. "You believe he plagiarized?" "No," Dubois snapped, jaw clenched. "I know he did. Years of my research on monastic architectural symbolism, he published under his name. My thesis, my blood, my work. He took it all, dressed it up in footnotes, and claimed it. And I became invisible. My reputation collapsed. His career flourished." The rawness in his voice silenced the room. Wynne turned to look at him, eyes narrowing as if seeing him anew. James Crawford, still near the manuscript, remained still as a statue, though his gaze flicked rapidly between the speakers, calculating, measuring. Poirot, unfazed, slowly nodded as if fitting a final puzzle piece into place. "So," he said softly, "the professor was not merely reading about betrayal, he was living it. And perhaps someone here believed that what had been stolen once must be paid for, in kind. Hatred is not the same as murder," she snapped suddenly, her voice rising with the sting of wounded pride. But there was a tremor beneath it, barely perceptible yet unmistakable to Poirot's sharply tuned instincts. "Yes, I despised him, Monsieur Poirot. He humiliated me professionally, undermined my life's work, and twisted every moment of collaboration into condescension, but that does not make me a killer." Her cheeks flushed, not merely with anger but with something far more volatile, fear, guilt, or perhaps a hidden memory clawing its way to the surface. "And even if I had in some mad moment wished him dead," she added breathlessly, her voice straining, "how could I have possibly managed such a horrific display? His body, the way it was found, it's not humanly possible. Look at that spire. You'd need wings or witchcraft to place him there." Poirot tilted his head thoughtfully, murmuring to himself more than anyone else. "Ah, but it is precisely the impossible that keeps me awake at night." His eyes lingered on her face for a moment longer, then drifted past her to Mr. Crawford. "And you, monsieur, you were among the last to see Professor Blackwood alive. Enlighten us, if you will. What were your impressions of his state of mind?" The American shifted uncomfortably, his hands folding, then unfolding behind his back, as if trying to conceal both guilt and memory. He was tense, paranoid even. He kept flipping to the same page in the manuscript over and over again. I watched him scribble something in a notebook, then hide it quickly when I passed. Whatever it was, he didn't want anyone else to see it. "This notebook," interrupted Inspector Beaumont, stepping forward with a glint of interest in his eye. "Have you seen it since?" Crawford shook his head, his lips pursed. "No, it wasn't with his personal effects, but if it's important, maybe it's still hidden somewhere in his chamber." Poirot raised a single eyebrow, his voice low but laced with irony. "So you have already conducted a search of his quarters? That was rather thorough of you." Crawford flushed, his gaze darting sideways. I was concerned. We were scheduled to meet at 6 to go over his notes. When he didn't show, I went looking." Poirot's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "And in this looking, what did you find?" Crawford hesitated, then answered, "Nothing suspicious. His bed wasn't slept in, but that's not so unusual. Sometimes when a scholar's on the brink of something big, sleep becomes secondary. At this, Dr. Wynne abruptly looked up, her expression pale and strained. But he did retire at the same time as the rest of us, shortly after 10. I saw him leave the hall myself. A rustle in the corridor drew their attention as Brother Augustine stepped forward from the shadows, his long robes whispering against the stone. His voice was soft but firm with conviction. Perhaps he returned to the scriptorium, the monk said. The manuscript has a way of calling back those who aren't ready to part from it. Something in his tone sent a prickle down my spine. You speak as though the book is alive, I said. The old man's eyes met mine, ancient and unblinking. The Codex Corvinus has been in our guardianship for over 700 years, Captain Hastings. Many have studied it. A few have understood it. Fewer still have emerged unchanged. Some were enlightened. Others, his voice trailed off, but the silence that followed was heavy. Others were consumed. Superstitious nonsense, muttered Ori from a corner, but the words lacked energy, as though even he no longer fully believed them. Poirot moved slowly toward the lectern, where the manuscript lay open, bathed in a pool of golden lamplight. Brother Augustine, he said in a tone of quiet inquiry, yesterday you mentioned that this text speaks of betrayal and vengeance. Could you be more specific? What is this tale of judgment? The monk approached slowly, reverently, his fingers hovering just above the parchment as though touching it would stir something ancient and volatile. It tells the story of Master Benedict, a scholar of great renown, and his protégé, a gifted but jealous man named Corvinus. Corvinus, hungry for recognition, stole his master's work on divine justice and passed it off as his own, but Benedict uncovered the treachery. The judgment was not only severe, it was symbolic. Corvinus was taken to the highest point of the abbey and impaled upon a spear. His blood was said to cry out for mercy, but none came. He was left for the ravens to peck at, a monument of shame and warning. There was a long pause. The ancient tale echoed too closely to the present. Dr. Wynne whispered, her voice dry with disbelief. The parallels are chillingly precise. Indeed, Poirot murmured, eyes now fixed on the inked illuminations that danced and curled across the page like flames. And Brother Augustine, in your long custodianship, have you ever noticed changes in this manuscript? Perhaps alterations that were not there before? The monk's brow furrowed deeply. Only last night, he admitted, after Professor Blackwood's intense examination, I noticed something, a mark, a symbol in the margin that had not been there before dusk. It was crude, rushed, almost burned into the page. His voice trembled. I fear, Monsieur Poirot, that this book no longer records only what was, it may now be writing what is. Certain discrepancies, Poirot muttered, narrowing his eyes as he leaned closer to the vellum surface, his fingertip gliding just above the delicate ink strokes without touching. A phrase reworded here, a marginalia symbol erased there, a date ever so slightly shifted, not errors, not oversights. No, these are intentional, surgical insertions, small enough to elude a casual reader, but screaming with purpose to someone intimate with the original text. A taut silence fell over the scriptorium, the kind that seems to muffle even the creaking of old wood, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Inspector Moreau, arms crossed, stepped forward. But who would alter such a sacred manuscript? And why? Poirot turned, his expression now thoughtful, sharp. To craft a new narrative, perhaps, one that casts events in a different light. The real question, mon ami, is this. Was the manuscript changed to reflect the murder, or was the murder staged to reflect the altered manuscript? His words struck the room like a thunderclap. Dr. Lefevieux's face drained of color, her voice barely above a whisper. You're suggesting someone murdered Professor Renaud to match a medieval execution described here? Poirot's reply was chillingly calm. I am suggesting, madame, that our killer is someone who believes justice is best delivered through historical symmetry and symbolic punishment. The group exchanged glances that carried more than just worry. They carried guilt, secrets, perhaps even complicity. Each person in that cold chamber was a scholar, a custodian of ancient texts, an expert in medieval Latin and paleography. Each possessed the precise skill set required to tamper with the manuscript so flawlessly it would pass undetected, unless one knew exactly what to look for. The room, already dim despite the rising sun, seemed to darken further, the corners swallowing light as though harboring hidden truths. Poirot stepped toward the lectern, withdrawing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat with a movement as fluid as sleight of hand, then bent over the manuscript, his breath slow, measured. There, he whispered. Fresh ink, the kind that dries slowly in these damp stone halls, still moist in the margins. A shiver ran through me as I followed his gaze to the faint glistening spots, alterations made not years ago, but days, perhaps hours before the murder. Before anyone could respond, a sharp clatter echoed through the corridor beyond, followed by the urgent, breathless call of Inspector Moreau. We rushed to the source, winding through the abbey's narrow halls until we reached a forgotten stairwell leading to the lower chambers. Moreau emerged from the shadows, flushed with adrenaline, holding up a coil of rope, a grapple hook, and dusty gloves. Monsieur Poirot. This was hidden behind a false wall in the crypt storage climbing gear, expertly concealed. Poirot nodded slowly, his voice like a knife sliding through silk. So it was not only a murder, it was a meticulously planned performance. The killer rehearsed this, prepared for every detail. This is not the work of impulse, it is the reenactment of judgment, of betrayal avenged through ritual. He turned back to the rest of us, and for the first time, I saw true steel in his gaze. This was not merely about silencing Professor Renaud, it was about condemning him within a framework of historical precedent. And the manuscript. It was rewritten, not just to deceive, but to warn. Outside, the wind howled, as if echoing the dead man's silent cry, and the tide surged over the causeway, severing us from the mainland. We were alone now, trapped with the truth, and perhaps with a killer still watching us through the very pages we came to study. The chamber Brother Mathieu guided us into felt less like a storage room and more like a forgotten crypt, shrouded in dim light and echoing with the weight of unspoken secrets. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old timber, oil, and ancient stone, a place where time seemed to hang suspended. Along the walls, ropes hung like sleeping serpents, and tools for masonry repair were scattered haphazardly, worn by years of use. But tucked behind a lopsided stack of lumber, like something deliberately hidden yet not entirely buried, lay a jarringly modern collection, an array of professional mountaineering gear, polished and precise, steel carabiners, high-tension ropes, friction devices, and an advanced pulley system that gleamed with unnatural newness in this decaying place. Poirot stepped forward with the silence of a man threading through a crime scene. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, scanned the equipment like a predator scenting fresh tracks. Voila, he breathed almost to himself, the fantasy made flesh. Someone did not merely plan, they rehearsed. The others entered slowly, unease thickening with each step. Brother Augustin paused at the threshold, face drawn tight, the folds of his robe trembling with age and alarm. These are not ours, he said finally, his voice raw with disbelief. The Abbey owns no such devices. We've never had reason. Then someone brought them in for a very specific purpose, Inspector Beaumont muttered grimly. The question is, how did they access a restricted storage room without notice? Brother Augustin, swallowing hard, offered a chilling explanation. During daylight, the Abbey is not sealed. Pilgrims and sightseers wander freely. To someone who knows our halls well, hiding such items, it wouldn't be difficult. That implication of an insider or a well-prepared intruder tightened the tension like a rope pulling taut. Crawford, who had just arrived, looked over the gear with visible discomfort. That's not hobbyist equipment, he remarked. That's the kind of setup you'd need for technical climbs. Sheer rock faces, precision movement, in the dark. Poirot turned his gaze on him, his voice casual, but with a keen undercurrent. A curious thing to note, monsieur. Spoken with the authority of experience, perhaps? Crawford blinked, color rising faintly in his cheeks. I've done some climbing in Colorado, basic alpine stuff, nothing this advanced, but I can spot pro gear when I see it. A beat later, Henri Dubois stepped into view, and the moment his eyes landed on the climbing gear, something in him fractured, his face blanched, jaw stiffened, and his hands curled involuntarily into fists. Poirot, always attuned to tremors of guilt or fear, turned. Monsieur Dubois, he said softly, your reaction is pronounced. Have you climbed before? Henri hesitated, then nodded, voice low and reluctant. Yes. During my architectural training, I studied the structural design of cathedrals. We often ascended towers and spires to examine historical integrity. I am accustomed to height. Before Poirot could probe further, a voice sliced through the growing silence, calm, sharp, and tinged with something cold. Dr. Wynne stood in the archway, pale but composed, her prior illness seemingly forgotten. How fortunate, she said dryly, eyes moving from Crawford to Dubois with surgical precision. 3 capable climbers, all in the right place at the wrong time. There was something unsettling in her tone, not just skepticism, but the flicker of accusation, veiled beneath civility. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The climbing gear was no longer a curiosity, it was evidence, transforming the murder from an impossible act to a perfectly orchestrated crime. We must test for prints, Beaumont declared, though his voice lacked conviction. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, though I suspect gloves were worn, and any trace wiped clean, still we search. Then with a subtle shift, Poirot asked, and the spire, has it been examined? Beaumont replied, the local fire brigade will arrive with the evening tide. They'll bring equipment to retrieve the body and examine the ascent path. As if summoned by the grim mention of the corpse, a fresh eruption of raven cries echoed from outside. I moved to the narrow window, and there they were, ravens wheeling in chaotic black circles around the spire, their calls slicing the air with eerie persistence. They do not leave, Brother Augustine murmured behind me. The ravens of Montichel, they remain where death lingers. It is said they mourn. Or wait, Crawford muttered grimly. Poetic perhaps, but hardly useful. And just then, as if the darkness wished to punctuate our discussion with blood, the abbey shuddered with a deafening crash. A scream tore through the corridor, a high, sharp note of terror, and we rushed toward it, our footsteps hammering against the stone floors. We found Dr. Wynne trembling, pressed against a narrow wall, her hands clawing at the stone behind her. At her feet lay a massive stone block, shattered into jagged fragments where it had struck, barely missing her. Poirot dropped beside it, examining the broken edge and the path it had taken. "This was not an accident," he said coldly. "This was deliberate, a message or an attempt. Our killer is not merely clever. They are bold and still among us." He stood slowly, his voice calm as thunder, "which means they are watching, perhaps even now." The stone struck the ground with a bone-shaking crash, the deafening sound echoing through the cloistered halls like the toll of a doomsday bell, and for a frozen heartbeat, time itself seemed to recoil. Dust billowed upward in a suffocating plume, momentarily blinding us all. And when it cleared, Dr. Wynne stood beneath the towering vaulted ceiling, her breath ragged, her face drained of color as she stared at the massive stone slab that now lay cracked open just inches from where her skull had been. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "If I hadn't stopped to study that symbol on the wall," and the implication of her near death trailed into silence, leaving a space so heavy it was like the abbey itself was holding its breath. Inspector Beaumont stepped forward, head craned toward the ceiling, his trained eye scanning every crevice. "Most curious," he murmured, narrowing his gaze. "There's no structural failure. The ceiling is undisturbed, no cracks, no fallen debris, no dislodged mortar. This stone wasn't loosened by time, it was dropped." At that, Poirot crouched low, his fingers brushing gently over the fallen stone as he brought his magnifying glass to the sharp edges. "Freshly cut," he pronounced softly, as if speaking a death sentence. "Not weathered, not aged, this block was introduced recently." I felt the chill coil around my spine. Then someone brought it here, positioned it, timed it for when she passed underneath. Poirot nodded gravely, the shadows catching in the folds of his brow. "Exactement. This was not chance, it was murder premeditated. The killer failed, but not for lack of intent. Madame Wynne was meant to die here, crushed beneath the weight of silence." She let out a trembling breath, then spoke, barely above a whisper. "But why? Why would anyone want me dead? I'm only here to study the manuscript." But even as she tried to rationalize the attack, I saw it, her eyes flickering across the others present. Crawford, standing stoic with his arms crossed like a sentry carved in granite. Dubois, whose expression had twisted into something unreadable, something too still, too quiet, something watching. Poirot's voice, ever so calm, sliced through the thickening silence. "Perhaps it would be best, madame, for your safety, to remain in your chambers, at least until we better understand who considers your discovery dangerous enough to kill for." As we walked her back to the guest quarters, each footstep echoed too loudly against the stone, each hallway felt darker than before, and the very walls seemed to whisper secrets in a language we were only beginning to comprehend. The attempted murder, the tampered manuscript, the climbing rope found coiled like a serpent in the scriptorium, all pieces of a puzzle designed with obsessive precision. But the purpose, still hidden in shadow. Outside, the ocean continued its slow assault, waves clawing higher against the rocks, inch by inch severing our link to the outside world. The abbey, already isolated by age and salt, now felt more like a trap than a refuge. Later that afternoon, as the sky grew anemic and grey, I found Poirot seated at the long oak table in the scriptorium, the ancient Codex Corvus unfurled before him like a corpse awaiting autopsy. He was murmuring to himself in French, his magnifying glass sweeping across the manuscript with the same delicate intensity a surgeon might apply to nerves. "Mon ami," he said without glancing up, "you arrive at the moment exact. Observe." He pointed to a passage we had reviewed earlier, the illustrated punishment of the monk Corvus, who legend said stole sacred knowledge and paid for it in blood. "Note the alteration here," Poirot whispered, directing my eye to a barely perceptible change in the date, the 20th year subtly altered to 30th. It was seamless, almost undetectable, but the implications were enormous. "This changes the entire timeline," I breathed. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. The forgery is exquisite, meant to remain buried, but someone wanted this history rewritten, to forge a connection between a death centuries past and our present danger." The air felt colder suddenly, as if the walls had moved closer, and then, as if summoned by the truth we had just unearthed, Dr. Wynne reappeared in the doorway, pale but now with a look not of fear but of fierce, unsettling realization, as though she had begun to understand that she was not simply a scholar uncovering the past, she was a thread woven directly into a pattern of murder, manipulation, and something far darker than any manuscript could contain. Despite Poirot's earlier insistence that she remain safely within her chamber, Dr. Evelyn Wynne stepped into the cold stone chamber of the scriptorium with a silent determination that seemed to draw the air still around her. Her silhouette, framed by the flickering torchlight, looked almost spectral, as if shaped by grief and tempered by resolve. She paused at the threshold, her breath steadying as though she were about to perform a ritual long delayed. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice brittle yet held with careful dignity, "I believe it is time I told you the complete truth about why I came to Montsangre." Poirot, who had been studying the ancient codex with his usual intensity, lifted his gaze slowly. The quiet shift in his posture, from observer to listener, carried the weight of anticipation. "Indeed, madame," he replied, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. "And what truth might that be?" She moved towards the lectern, the echoes of her footsteps muffled against the ancient stones, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if they alone were holding her together. "My father, Dr. William Wynne, was not merely a scholar of medieval manuscripts, he was a visionary, a man of precision, of passion, and of unrelenting honesty. He was also Edmund Blackwood's mentor, his teacher, and his collaborator, for over a decade." The words hit the room like a dropped stone into still water, sending ripples of unease through the ancient air. Even the rustling pages of the codex seemed to pause. Poirot's eyes narrowed, reading her face, searching for the shadows behind her words. "Your father worked with Professor Blackwood?" he asked, though the answer already danced at the edge of his knowing. "More than worked with him," she said bitterly. "He trusted him. My father discovered the Codex Corvus's true meaning nearly 20 years ago. He spent years unraveling the metaphors, connecting its cryptic allusions to real historical conspiracies, betrayals, acts of vengeance, secret societies that manipulated knowledge and power across generations. It was meant to be his magnum opus, the final, crowning work of a lifetime. But before he could publish it, before he could even defend it, Blackwood stole every word, every hypothesis, every conclusion. He published it under his own name, crafted it as if he had been the one to decipher it all." Poirot remained silent, letting her story bloom in the quiet. "And when my father protested," she continued, her voice quivering, "Blackwood turned the academic world against him. He used his reputation like a weapon." No one believed my father, the brilliant but reclusive scholar, over the charming, celebrated Blackwood. He was mocked, humiliated, and eventually erased. She paused then, the emotion finally cracking through, tears slipping down her cheeks. He couldn't live with the shame, watching his life's work credited to someone else. Watching himself be cast as a jealous fraud, it broke something inside him. He took his own life. The room held its breath. Even the constant cawing of the island's ravens had died away, as if the island itself were listening. Poirot's voice, when it came, was soft, a balm over the jagged wound she had opened. "So you came here, not simply as a researcher but as a daughter. Seeking what, madame? Justice? Revenge? Closure?" Evelyn wiped her tears slowly with a white handkerchief that trembled slightly in her grasp. "I came to prove my father's research was original. I believed that if I could demonstrate how shallow Blackwood's understanding truly was, how he merely echoed discoveries he never comprehended, then perhaps the truth would finally speak louder than his lies." But Poirot tilted his head, thoughtful. "And yet instead you found yourself caught in a pattern eerily similar to the one your father discovered within the Codex itself. Layers of betrayal, secrets, shadows that repeat." The words hung heavy, when suddenly a new presence shifted into view from the corridor. James Crawford stepped into the chamber, his footsteps hesitant, his face drawn, paler than usual. "Dr. Wynne," he said formally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I believe I owe you not just an apology but an explanation." She turned to him with surprise, her tears still glistening. "Mr. Crawford," he inhaled deeply, as though preparing to reveal a hidden truth. "My name is James Crawford. Yes, but I am not an amateur historian. I'm an investigative journalist, and I came to Montsangre specifically to expose Professor Blackwood." The confession dropped like a blade. Poirot's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Expose him?" Crawford nodded grimly. "For decades Blackwood has stolen from others. Your father was not the only one. I have documented at least 6 similar cases, 6 brilliant academics whose work he quietly appropriated, whose voices he silenced. Some had their careers ruined. Some disappeared from public life altogether. And one, your father, paid the ultimate price." Evelyn's mouth fell open slightly, her shock raw. "You knew about him?" "I did," Crawford said quietly. "His was the first case I began investigating. I never forgot his name. Before the weight of that revelation could settle, the chamber grew darker still as another figure entered, Henri Dubois, eyes shadowed and mouth tight. He glanced at Evelyn, at Crawford, and finally at Poirot. "You're not the only ones with a score to settle with Blackwood," he said coldly. "I suggest you hear my story next." And in that instant it became clear. What had begun as a scholarly retreat had become something far more dangerous. The Codex had awakened the ghosts of a dozen ruined lives, and each of us, knowingly or not, had been drawn into its web of betrayal, vengeance and truth still buried beneath centuries of silence. Henri Dubois' voice sliced through the tense silence like a shard of glass dragged across velvet, precise, bitter, and filled with long-simmering venom. The words were not shouted, yet they carried the weight of decades, echoing across the ancient stone walls of the scriptorium like a curse finally spoken aloud. He hadn't just overheard the conversation, he had absorbed it, word by damning word, like poison collecting in the veins of a man already on the brink. Slowly emerging from the shadows of the cloistered archway, his silhouette flickered in the candlelight, half devoured by darkness. His eyes burned beneath furrowed brows, his features worn not by age but by betrayal calcified over time. "So," he began, each syllable dripping with a cold satisfaction twisted by pain, "I wasn't the only one dissected on Blackwood's academic altar. Misery, it seems, has always preferred the company of the gifted." His voice lingered like a haunting note in a cathedral, and everyone turned, startled by the sudden rupture in silence. Evelyn gasped softly, taking a half-step back, her face pale and lips trembling, not just from fear but from the sickening realization that the web of Blackwood's cruelty stretched even further than she'd imagined. "Dr. Dubois, I had no idea that you too." Her voice faltered under the weight of her own guilt. Henri's bitter chuckle stopped her cold. It was not a laugh but a sound of scornful recognition, like the last note in a requiem. "That I too suffered," he snapped. "No, Miss Warwick, I didn't merely suffer. He gutted me, publicly, thoroughly. He stole my research piece by piece, publishing my findings as if he were the conjurer and I the vanished coin. The academic world, my world, turned its back without so much as a whisper. By the time I realized what had happened, the journals had already lauded him. He erased me, not with force but with ink, and now I am but a ghost haunting the very corridors I once helped shape." His voice cracked, not with weakness, but with fury so deeply repressed it came out fractured, sharp and deadly. The room fell into a tense, grief-stricken hush. Evelyn couldn't meet his gaze. Dr. Wynne stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides, jaw taut with memories of his own mutilated career. There was a collective silence, a painful resonating stillness, as if the Abbey itself were holding its breath, and in that moment something passed between the three, an unspoken recognition of shared ruin. Three brilliant minds, once destined to lead, now reduced to shadows of themselves by the same man, Professor Blackwood. Poirot, who had remained unnervingly calm throughout, now stepped forward, his posture still but his eyes alive with unsettling clarity. The candlelight caught the gleam in his gaze as he slowly steepled his fingertips, his voice barely above a murmur. "Mon Dieu," he said, his tone edged with revelation. "It is as I feared. 3 lives, 3 legacies, broken not by chance but by design. Each of you with a motive steeped in pain and humiliation. And yet, my friends, motive alone does not birth murder. None. For such a crime, one so symbolic, so theatrical, one requires more, the means, the opportunity, and a mind capable of orchestrating such grotesque poetry." His words were cut short by the sudden soft creak of the chapel door. Brother Augustine stepped inside, rainwater still dripping from the edges of his habit, leaving a slick trail on the stone floor. His face, usually calm and composed, was now tight with unease, his eyes wide with something between dread and disbelief. "Forgive me," he said, his voice hoarse as if scraped raw by the wind outside, "but there is something you must all hear. More edits have appeared in the manuscript. Not last night, this afternoon, while we were all gathered by the mountainside." The room froze, Poirot's eyes narrowed, his demeanor suddenly taut. "Edits?" he asked, voice clipped. Augustine gave a slow nod. "Yes, they were not present this morning. I checked, but now, they are there, fresh ink, same hand, entire passages rewritten. The tone has changed. It no longer merely speaks of justice for the past, it warns of vengeance yet to come. It speaks of more deaths. It names no one, but it implies everyone. There's something prophetic about it. As though the killer is no longer content with hiding, they are speaking directly to us, through the codex itself." Evelyn staggered slightly, grabbing the edge of a wooden lectern for support. "More deaths?" she whispered, her voice hollow. "But Blackwood is already—" "Perhaps," Poirot interrupted, softer now. "His death was not the climax but the opening act." The candles flickered violently, a gust of wind surging through the scriptorium as if some invisible force had inhaled. Outside, the ravens exploded into a frenzy of caws, wild, piercing, dissonant. It was the kind of sound that didn't simply echo in your ears, it clung to your skin. In that moment, the manuscript no longer looked like a relic of the past. It breathed. It shifted. The words on its brittle pages seemed to shimmer with intention, no longer content to recount history. They now reached forward, writing fate. Poirot stepped toward it, his fingers hovering just above the parchment. "This is no longer just a murder," he said solemnly. "It is a performance, and we are its unwilling cast." Thunder cracked above the abbey like a whip, the ancient windows rattling in their frames. Somewhere in the long corridor beyond, footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate, retreating into the hollow spine of the building. We all turned, but the hallway was empty. Just shadows, just the breath of old stone. Poirot did not move. His eyes remained fixed on the codex. "We are not simply solving a crime," he said finally, his voice a whisper now, almost reverent. "We are unraveling a manuscript that is not finished. The killer is still writing, not with ink, but with blood. And if we do not stop them, one of us will be the next line." Lightning tore through the sky, illuminating the ancient stained glass windows of the abbey, which shimmered like trapped fragments of forgotten time suddenly brought to life. Heavy raindrops pelted the stone walls, and within the scriptorium, an unsettling silence hung in the air, an eerie, unfamiliar dread that seemed to breathe through the very walls. Between the faces holding their breath, a heavy stillness lingered, until a voice sliced through it like a blade. Arthur Lemarchand stepped forward, emerging from the shadows into the flickering light like a man standing on the edge of a long-delayed confession. His eyes were weary, but a fire burned quietly behind them. "I have something to confess," he said, his voice measured. "But first understand this. I'm neither entirely innocent nor completely guilty." Inspector Lennox sat up straighter, fixing his gaze on him. "What exactly are you confessing to, Monsieur Lemarchand?" Arthur moved toward the window where his reflection blurred in the rain like a lost soul drifting in purgatory. "I made the plan," he said plainly. "I studied every inch of this abbey for months, every ancient staircase, every hidden tunnel, every forgotten path. I smuggled in climbing gear piece by piece, hiding it where no eyes would go, especially beneath the long-sealed wine cellars." Dr. Rhea Caldwell gasped softly, her fingers instinctively rising to her lips as if fear had touched her. Brother Matthias clutched his rosary and began to murmur a prayer. "Are you confessing to murder?" Lennox asked, pen poised but his gaze unflinching like that of a judge. "No," Arthur replied. "I'm confessing to the plan, not the act. Someone else used what I built when I lost my nerve." Detective Corwin narrowed his eyes, absorbing each word as if testing its weight. "You're saying the killer used the paths you secretly mapped out?" Arthur nodded. "Yes. Last night I was consumed with facing Aldrich, the man who ruined my name, destroyed my life. I wanted him to die suffocating in the same darkness where he had left me. But when I went to retrieve the gear, it was gone. The rope, the hooks, the pulleys, everything. Outside, thunder cracked, and the abbey's glass trembled as if some old spirit had screamed. "Did you see anyone? Hear footsteps?" Lennox asked. "Nothing," Arthur said. "Only silence, as if the abbey itself was questioning me." He paused, then spoke again, softer. "And this morning, all of it was back. Everything was returned to the exact place I'd hidden it, as if someone wanted to frame me." The room fell into absolute stillness. Only the sound of rain remained, and far off the scream of a raven no one could quite interpret. "Which means someone already knew your intentions," Dr. Caldwell said, her voice now edged with suspicion. "Someone watched you, memorized your movements, and struck when your resolve cracked," Corwin added. "The question is, who among us knew you so intimately?" Ewan Gray, who had been silently watching until now, leaned forward. "I admit, I saw Arthur taking too keen an interest in the abbey's maps, examining towers, asking about access to upper floors." Arthur turned to him, eyes flashing. "You were spying on me." Ewan met his gaze without flinching. "I was observing everyone. I'm a journalist. Everyone here has a story, and yours wasn't one that could stay hidden." Brother Matthias lowered his head. "I too saw you circling the tower, touching the walls like you were trying to feel something. I thought perhaps you had fallen in love with the abbey. Perhaps you had, in a different way." "How convenient that everyone saw something," Dr. Caldwell murmured, but now her tone was probing, analytical. Everyone suspected Arthur. Everyone had eyes on him, so the real killer used that, redirected every suspicion toward him. Corwin glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "You speak as if you're part of this secret." Caldwell allowed herself a faint smile, one only she could understand. "I only know this much. Once you've read a person's mind, their innocence or guilt becomes just another puzzle." There was a beat, an unspoken moment in which everyone looked at each other and themselves. Then somewhere deep in the abbey, a long-forgotten bell tolled. Not for prayer, not for ceremony, but as if heralding the arrival of another sin. and in that instant everyone understood the game wasn't over. The killer had left more than a body. They'd planted an idea, a presence. The next murder wouldn't be a mistake. It would be deliberate, authored like a chilling story, and the writer was still among them. The storm screamed across the cliffs of St. Ronan's Hollow, its howling winds clawing at the crumbling abbey walls as if seeking entrance into the secrets hidden within. Inside, beneath the trembling candlelight of the old reliquary hall, Inspector Marceau's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. "So tell me, Madame Verlaine, did you come to the abbey merely to translate relics, or to bury the truth alongside them?" Her composure, once as polished as the scholarly awards lining her study walls, began to fracture under the weight of his gaze. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, though her eyes betrayed her. "Oh, but I believe you do," Marceau pressed, stepping forward as the storm punctuated his words with a thunderclap. "You see, no academic embarks on an expedition of this magnitude without several preparatory visits, ones where she might witness, say, a colleague like Monsieur Theroux mapping out the abbey's bell tower, smuggling in tools, quietly rehearsing a tragedy disguised as an accident." Verlaine trembled, clutching the folds of her coat. "I never saw." "But you did," Marceau interrupted smoothly, his tone like velvet wrapping a blade. "You saw more than you let on. You knew Theroux hated Blackstone, knew how the professor discredited his life's work, humiliated him at the Montfort Symposium, how he lost his tenure, his funding, his purpose. You let him do the heavy lifting, madame. You let his hatred pave the way, and then you repurposed it for your own gain." Gasps rippled through the assembled onlookers, Father Lucien with his trembling rosary, Lady Pembroke clutching her pearls, and Antoine Delacourt, the journalist whose pen hovered like a dagger above his notepad. Verlaine's lips parted, but no words came, only the soft intake of breath before a dam breaks. "Tell me then," Marceau continued, circling her, "what did you do with Blackstone's field journal, the one missing from his satchel, the one that contains notes not just on the relics, but on their true origin, their connection to the forbidden texts hidden beneath the crypt floor?" Her eyes darted to the locked cabinet in the corner, just for a second, but enough. Delacourt's pen scratched frantically. "You don't understand," she whispered hoarsely. "He was going to destroy everything, rewrite the history of St. Ronan with lies. I only wanted to protect the truth. By murdering him," Marceau asked softly, "or by standing aside while another did it for you?" Silence fell, broken only by the wind howling like a chorus of ancient souls. "Enough," came Father Lucien's solemn voice. "The abbey has harbored enough sin. Speak now, child, or be swallowed by it." But Verlaine stood motionless, tears streaking her face as her silence confirmed everything her lips would not. The storm outside rose to a climax, lightning cleaving the sky as Marceau turned toward the ancient stairwell that led to the tower. "Come," he said, his voice now low and commanding. "It is time we uncover how the impossible was made possible, and why the truth was worth killing for." Behind him, footsteps fell into reluctant rhythm, shadows stretching ahead like ghosts, and somewhere above the crows began to gather. The wind howled like a wounded beast as we ascended the crumbling spiral of the abbey's ancient bell tower, the storm thrashing around us with a vengeance that felt almost personal. Inspector Miraz led the way, his coat flapping wildly behind him, while I followed close behind, heart pounding with the weight of what we were about to confront. Above us, suspended like a grotesque marionette against the lightning-lashed heavens, the lifeless body of Professor Reynard swayed gently from the iron spire, eerily theatrical, meticulously placed. "He didn't die here," Dastan said, his voice cutting through the gale like a blade. This is a message, not a murder." As he moved toward a shadowed recess in the tower's wall, he revealed a cleverly hidden pulley system, ropes and carabiners still damp from recent use. "The killer used this to stage the final tableau," he explained, pulling the ropes taut to demonstrate. Reynard's death wasn't about the act itself, but the symbolism behind it. Inspector Miraz, skeptical, examined the system with narrowed eyes, but Dastan's certainty didn't waver. "He was dead long before he ever touched this spire," he said. "The real death occurred somewhere far more intimate." I felt the chill before he spoke the next words. "In a study at Oxford, one preserved for 20 years like a tomb, untouched, frozen in time. All eyes turned to Alara Vance, Reynard's former student, now a respected academic in her own right, whose expression began to crack beneath the weight of implication. You kept that room exactly as your father left it," Dastan continued, "because it wasn't just a memory, it was a shrine, a furnace in which you forged your revenge." The wind tore at our coats, and lightning lit Alara's face in stark, agonizing detail. Anguish, rage, sorrow, all fighting for control. "Professor Reynard didn't just steal your father's work," Dastan said, stepping closer. "He drove him to take his life, and you made him feel the same helplessness. Same hour, same room, same silence before the end. Crawford's notepad slipped from his hands as the truth settled like ice over the group. She didn't just kill him, Dastan added, his voice almost reverent. She recreated a death precisely, poetically. Alara's lips trembled as she leaned back against the cold stone wall, eyes brimming with something that wasn't quite guilt, something older, deeper. You weren't there, she whispered. You didn't see what it did to him, how it hollowed him out. But you were there, Dastan said softly, and you never left. Not truly. The storm cracked above us like a divine verdict as Alara's final mask slipped, revealing a woman not mad, but consumed by memory, by justice, by grief twisted into something sharp and deadly. I didn't want to kill him, she said at last, voice barely audible above the wind. I wanted him to break the way he broke my father, and in that moment we no longer stood at the scene of a murder, we stood inside a reckoning, born of pain, precision, and 2 decades of carefully bottled vengeance. He deserved it, she said suddenly, her voice slicing through the roar of the storm like a dagger, rising above the thunder's fury. He deserved to feel the weight of betrayal, the loneliness of death creeping in while every memory burns like acid, just like my father did that night in his study, alone, dishonored, erased. Clara, Detective Alden whispered hoarsely, stepping forward with his badge half raised. What have you done? But Clara Venn was past the threshold of logic now, her words spilling with the force of a dam broken, emotions long buried clawing their way to the surface. You want to know how I did it? She spat, a bitter smile twisting her lips as she turned toward the edge of the cathedral's storm-swept spire. Fine, I'll tell you. I watched Malcolm for months, memorized his routines, his little lies, his pride, his arrogance. I knew he'd never resist my invitation to see the lost research, my father's last unpublished work, sealed away for decades, promised to be the crown jewel of his legacy. Lightning cracked, illuminating the twisted hunger in her eyes. I met him at the observatory. I poured him wine laced with hyoscine, silent, undetectable, the same compound my father was forced to take when his accident was so conveniently timed before Malcolm's big breakthrough. When he felt his limbs go numb, when he gasped and realized what was happening, I watched it unfold, the same fear, the same confusion, and I whispered, "Now you know." Constable Derry scribbled in a drenched notebook, his hand shaking. "But the body," he stammered. "You couldn't have brought it here alone, across the broken bridge past the tide." Clara laughed, a sound cold and metallic like a blade unsheathing. "Gareth helped me. He just didn't know it. I tracked his obsession with Malcolm's betrayal, his secret plans to expose him. I stole his access codes, his boat, even his blackmail folder. I simply waited for him to make the first move, then hijacked it." Gareth staggered back, eyes wide. "You used me," he murmured, realization dawning like frostbite. "You turned my grief into a cover story." Clara tilted her head, pity and condescension mingling. "Your plan was rage, mine was resurrection. I didn't just kill Malcolm. I dismantled his illusion, piece by piece, and rebuilt the truth my father died protecting." Alden reached for his cuffs, but Clara's foot shifted closer to the edge of the slick stone parapet, wind catching her coat as the abyss below screamed with the voice of the sea. "Dr. Venn, step back. Whatever you've done, this isn't how it ends," he said. "But it is," she whispered, eyes locked on the ocean beyond where the tide had begun to retreat, revealing the bones of a long-lost archive chamber, long rumored to have collapsed decades ago. "Justice isn't always legal," she added, her voice now calm, eerie. "Sometimes it's poetic." And as the ravens above let out a chilling cry, circling the storm-lit tower with ancient knowing, I realized this was never about vengeance, it was about memory. Memory so precise, so sharpened, that it carved a path through time itself, and tonight it had finally arrived at its reckoning. The storm raged like a living beast across the cliffside, lightning clawing at the sky, and waves crashing with thunderous fury against the rocks below, but none of it could drown out the venom in Dr. Mira Caldwell's voice as she stood atop the old lighthouse, her silhouette stark against the chaos. "He deserved it," she said, her tone calm but laced with a fury that had fermented over decades. "He deserved to die knowing what betrayal tastes like, the same way my brother did when Dr. Hughes stole his life's work and left him to rot in obscurity." Inspector Rourke took a cautious step forward, sensing the fraying edge of her restraint. "Tell me how you did it," he asked, voice steady despite the wind lashing around them. Mira's lips curled into a cold, joyless smile, one of those smiles that hold secrets too heavy for words. "I studied him for years, his routines, his arrogance, his hunger for legacy. I sent him an email, baited him with a manuscript, my brother's real notes, the proof that he was the true mind behind the formula Hughes had built his fame upon. I knew he'd come, pride always blinds men like him." Lightning lit the sky again, revealing the slick path behind the lighthouse and a dark shape beginning to emerge in the receding tide. Mira didn't notice. I offered him wine, laced with belladonna, a gentle killer he never suspected. When the fear crept in, when his breath began to shallow, and the truth finally dawned, I led him into the same decaying study where my brother died. I made him face the ghost of the man he destroyed. As her words hung in the air, Rourke's eyes shifted past her, narrowing on the shape revealed by the retreating water, a rusted vehicle, its roof just breaching the sand. "You made one mistake," he said suddenly, his voice slicing through the roar of the storm. Mira turned, confusion flickering across her face. "The tide," Rourke explained, pointing. "You thought it would hide everything, but the storm shifted the sea's rhythm. Your secret is rising from the deep." Below them, the outline of a sunken car, old, waterlogged and unmistakable, was now visible in the shifting sands. Helen, the reporter who had silently chronicled every moment, rushed toward the scene, notebook clutched in trembling hands. "There'll be evidence inside. Blood, fibers, signs of transport. Everything we need to prove it," she called. Mira's face went pale. "No," she whispered. "I studied the tides. It wasn't supposed to be seen for 3 more days. But you didn't account for the storm," Rourke said, stepping closer. "You planned every variable except nature, one unpredictable force, and your entire narrative unravels." Mira's posture sagged as the weight of inevitability sank in. Her gaze drifted over the storm-torn ocean, her breath shaky, as though the years of careful deception had suddenly turned on her. 20 years, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. 20 years I waited, plotted every step, only for the sea to betray me. Below, Coast Guards were making their way toward the car, flashlights bobbing in the darkness, while Father Nolan finally broke his silence. "Your brother was a gifted man," he said softly. "But he wouldn't have wanted justice served this way." Mira turned to him with eyes glassy from a mix of grief and fury. "You didn't see what it did to him," she said bitterly. "You didn't watch him rip his own name from his research, night after night, until there was nothing left. You talk about peace, but peace doesn't come for the forgotten. Sometimes justice requires blood." Or sometimes, Rourke interrupted, justice, when stripped of compassion, becomes vengeance, and vengeance consumes everything, including those who carry it. Almost on cue, the storm began to abate. The wind slowed, and the thunder grew distant, as if the night itself had grown weary of violence. Overhead, ravens returned to their perches, their calls echoing across the ruined cliffs. Mira said nothing more. Her expression hardened into a resigned stillness as Rourke stepped forward, handcuffs ready. "Dr. Mira Caldwell," he said firmly, "you are under arrest for the murder of Dr. Isaac Hughes. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say may be used as evidence against you." She offered no resistance, only a final glance out to sea, where her plan, her vengeance and her secrets were now laid bare by the indifferent hand of nature. Behind them, Helen was already shaping the story in her mind, a tale not just of murder, but of ambition, obsession, and the quiet, consuming cost of justice misused. The iron clink of the handcuffs echoed off the cold stone walls, as the final lock snapped shut. Dr. Elira Harrow's defiance slowly giving way to exhaustion, her calculated calm cracking just enough to let something deeper slip through. "There's something else you need to know," she murmured as Commander Wren led her toward the spiral stairs descending from the Citadel's observatory. "Professor Aldwin wasn't the only one," she said, her voice low, eyes fixed on the flickering lantern light ahead. "There were others, 8 that I've confirmed so far. Scientists, historians, scholars, every one of them had their life's work quietly harvested, repackaged, and claimed by the same network of elite minds who built their careers on systematic theft." Inspector Braith froze, his brow furrowed. "Where's the evidence?" he asked. Elira didn't hesitate. "Hidden in my father's crypt, beneath the old chapel ruins. A vault he built, out of fear, perhaps guilt. Letters, manuscripts, annotated blueprints, even original formulae. Everything that proves Aldwin wasn't a solitary villain, but merely the most prominent face of a legacy of intellectual grave robbing." Through the cracked stained glass of the abandoned scriptorium, the final pages of the Codex Nocturnus glimmered faintly in the moonlight. The very manuscript whose altered passages had first sparked this chain of revelations, and whose bloodied margins now bore the confession of its last custodian. As we descended the winding staircase, the wind that had howled all night through the towers of Eldwire began to still, the storm's fury giving way to a ghostly silence. Through the warped windows I saw the causeway slowly re-emerging from the retreating sea, the tide revealing a path back to the mainland and to truth. By dawn, the authorities would comb the marsh where Aldwin's sunken car had been found, and beneath its rusted frame they would uncover evidence of coercion, of disappearances quietly masked as academic rivalries gone cold. Across the channel, Inquisitor Darian would sail home with a bitter taste in his mouth, realizing he'd been a pawn in a revenge far more ancient than he understood, while Rowan Kessler, once a skeptic, would write the exposé that finally shattered the pristine image of the Ivory Council, the revered scholars whose legacies would now be forever stained. The Codex Nocturnus, thought to be a collection of medieval parables, would return to its crypt beneath the Abbey Library, its true nature finally unsealed, a relic not of faith but of hidden truths and crimes encoded in metaphor, waiting centuries to be understood. As we stepped into the cathedral's nave, I caught sight of Keeper Merrow gently closing the illuminated tome, his gloved fingers lingering on the final page as if reluctant to let it go. Outside, the ravens that had gathered restlessly on the battlements for 3 long days now rose as one into the silver dawn, their black wings cutting across the sky like ink on parchment. Their vigil ended. Their silence was not absence but closure. The tale was told. The shadows they had watched over had at last been named. As the tide drew back and light spilled across the moss-covered stones of Eldwire, I felt the weight of something eternal settle in the air. That no matter how long truth is buried beneath layers of legacy and silence, time and tide are always patient, and their judgment once passed cannot be undone. And so, as the echoes of Eldwire Harrow's confession faded into the stonework of the ancient island, it became clear, this was never merely a tale of murder, but of erasure, vengeance, and the cost of rewriting history with stolen ink. If you felt the chill of ancient justice in these walls, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unravelings of forgotten truths. Until next time, remember what the ravens of Eldwire have shown us: truth is not buried, it waits, and it always eventually returns.